Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, and these great intellectual giants. We know a lot about St. Augustine from his own spiritual autobiography, his work, The Confessions, where he goes through and talks about his conversion from being a pagan, from living a life separate from Christ, to embracing the faith. He also wrote a work called The City of God, a historical work where he tries to answer the question of what happened to Rome in the year 410. And what happened in Rome in the year 410 was Alaric, who was a German barbarian chieftain. It was a Roman auxiliary, so he held a Roman commission. He and his troops were actually part of the Roman army, their auxiliary part of the Roman army. But he was upset, Alaric was upset that he believed he didn't receive enough recognition for the efforts that he and his troops put into defending the Roman Empire. And so he wanted to have a greater title bestowed upon him along a regular commission in the Roman army. So he wasn't granted that by the emperor. He was upset. So he takes his warriors and he marches on Rome. And when he arrives in Rome in the year 410, he sacks the city and causes much death and destruction. And it had been the first time that Rome was sacked by a German barbarian chieftain. And so many people in the empire, this whole event sent shockwaves throughout the whole empire. It was a huge event. It would be for us in modern day time, if we were to try to make an analogy to it, it would be as if, the Canadians poured across the border and came to Washington, D.C. and burned our capital and destroyed our capital. I mean, it would just be an amazingly important event that would affect not only the country, but the world. So Alaric's sack of Rome was an important event. I mean, it affected the empire and it affected the whole known world at the time. So many citizens of the empire blamed the Christians and the Christian faith, the acceptance of the empire of the Christian faith, for Alaric's sack. So we've seen this before too, where things don't go right in the empire, and then the empire, or people in the empire, blame the Christians. It's the same thing, except now it's happening in the 5th century. So what St. Augustine did was he wrote this work, The City of God, as a defense of the faith against paganism's claim that the faith was responsible for the empire's decay and was responsible for Alaric's sack. He mentions in his work on the City of God that there's the difference between the city of man, which is founded and based on self-love, and the city of God, which is based on the love of God and selflessness. So he makes and draws this comparison between these two cities, the city of man, the city of God. And he says that the faith is the key to world's history, that it is the divine light that illuminates and explains the story of humanity. So we can't, he's in essence saying you can't just discard the faith and think as if it has no bearing in the world. It has central bearing upon the world. We have to know and be members of the church and know the faith in order to understand the history of the world. It is the faith, it is Christ that illuminates for us the reason for our existence, the reason for even the existence of the empire, and of where we're supposed to go in our life and what we are supposed to do. Now, St. Augustine is also very important, not only for his theological works and the writing here of the City of God, but he also fought many heresies that had arisen during this time in the history of the church. He fought in particular against two heresies, one called Donatism and the other called Pelagianism. Donatism was the belief that had arisen here in North Africa during this time, that the validity of a sacrament depended upon the worthiness of the minister. So a sacrament was only validly celebrated if the minister who celebrated it, if the priest who celebrated it, was of a moral and upright life. If this priest was in sin, or had committed some kind of sin, and was living an immoral life, then whatever sacrament he performed was invalid in the eyes of the Donatists. And as you can see, that would cause if that was true, that would cause a huge problem in the church. Right? How would you know that the minister was actually living a moral life? You wouldn't know if the sacrament was valid or not. And all that would do would lead to skepticism, and ultimately would lead to a leaving the faith and walking away from the faith. If you can't know for certain whether or not a sacrament is validly celebrated, then why even go to the sacraments? And you can see how just horribly destructive this type of heresy could be to the church. So St. Augustine fought that heresy in particular and said it's not the worthiness of the minister that makes a sacrament, the celebration of the sacrament, valid. By definition, because we are fallen yet redeemed creatures, the minister who performs or celebrates the sacrament is unworthy. But that God, through his grace, has chosen this man to be his instrument through which he will confer grace on us through the celebration of these sacraments. So he gave a great explanation of sacramental theology and of what it means, or how we understand the valid celebration of a sacrament. So he also fought against Pelagianism. And Pelagianism comes from Pelagius, who was a British monk. And basically what Pelagius did was he denied the transmission of original sin. So Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they were given the command to not eat of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day they eat of it, they will die. It was a command God gave to them. They ate of the fruit, they committed original sin, the relationship that they had with each other was broken, the relationship they had with God was broken, and we believe that that original sin that they committed then was transmitted, or is transmitted, to all future generations of human beings. Pelagius denied that transmission. He said the original sin of Adam and Eve was a personal sin of Adam and Eve and does not affect the rest of us, does not affect the rest of humanity. And so in essence, really, it's a denial of Jesus' saving mission. Why would Jesus need to come if not to restore all things to God? In order to restore the relationship that humanity had with God before the fall, and to restore the relationship that men and women had with each other, that Adam and Eve had with each other before they committed that original sin. So in essence, he's also denying Christ's saving mission. He really believed that Jesus was nothing more than a good role model. Jesus came to just give us a good example, a good idea of how we should live, but nothing more than that. But in essence, Jesus was just this good role model, and that he, in no way, shape, or form, that his passion, death, or resurrection have any kind of huge effect on us. Right? In essence, we could gain heaven by our own efforts. If we just lived a good moral life, we didn't need God's grace, we didn't need Jesus' sacrifice, we could just, by our own design and our own will, get to heaven. And again, Augustine, through his teaching of grace and the role of grace and how grace is operative in our life, and the whole understanding of Jesus' salvific mission, attacks Pelagianism and gave the church a solid theological foundation with which to engage and discuss these heresies. Ultimately, St. Augustine dies in the year 430 in the city of Hippo, while his city was under siege by the Vandals. The Vandals were one of these German barbaric tribes who had come down into North Africa and were trying to conquer North Africa. And interestingly enough, the Vandals were Arians. So they were this Christian heretical, they followed the Christian heretical group of Arianism. So now a few years after, actually 1 year after St. Augustine's death, we have the calling of another ecumenical council in the history of the church. This is the third ecumenical council, the Council of Ephesus. And this council meets in 431 because there was the Patriarch of Constantinople, a man by the name of Nestorius, attacks the Blessed Virgin Mary, and he also attacks Jesus Christ. Nestorius preached on Christmas Day of 428 that Mary was not the mother of God. This is what he said. They ask whether Mary may be called God-bearer. But has God then a mother? Mary did not bear God. The creature did not bear the Creator, but the man who is the instrument of the Godhead. He who was formed in the womb of Mary was not God himself, but God assumed him. So Nestorius attacks Mary, says Mary is not the mother of God, even though she's been venerated as such through the history of the church. But he also attacks Jesus and says that really what Jesus, God came down, he took on this kind of fleshy human garment. But he wasn't really truly human. So in essence, he really believes that there's two persons of Christ. There's not the one divine person of Jesus Christ, but rather there's a divine Jesus and a human Jesus. And what Mary did was Mary gave birth to the human Jesus, but not the divine Jesus. This is what he wrote further. He said, the eternal God cannot be born, suffer, and die. Therefore, Christ's humanity is merely a garment which God puts on. And Mary conceived and bore only that fleshy garment. So not only is he attacking Mary, and how the church has always venerated and honored Mary, but he's attacking Christ and saying there's two different persons who were Jesus. There's this divine Jesus and a human Jesus. And this human Jesus, took on the flesh of Mary, but it's not the same divine Jesus. He really put this dichotomy into the person and nature of Jesus Christ. So in Greek, he said that Mary was Christotokos, or Christ-bearer, bearer of the human flesh of Jesus, but not Theotokos, or God-bearer in Greek. Now, St. Cyril was Patriarch of Alexandria at this time, and he condemns Nestorius' preaching and his teaching on the nature of Christ and on the role of the Blessed Mother. He writes a letter to his monks, and this letter, St. Cyril really hits the nail on the head as to what Nestorius' heresy is all about. He says this, I am astonished that the question should ever have been raised as to whether the Holy Virgin should be called Mother of God. For it really amounts to asking, is her son God, or is he not? That was really, St. Cyril saw right through Nestorius' issue and said, this is a fundamental issue. Nestorius is questioning whether or not Jesus is truly God. And in some respects, we might think of St. Cyril, kind of thinking to himself, didn't we just deal with this? The Arian heresy. Didn't the church deal with this at the Council of Nicaea? Why are you, again, another heresy arising in the East, in Constantinople? What are you thinking? So Pope Celestine I condemns Nestorius' teachings. The emperor convokes another ecumenical council, the Council of Ephesus. The Pope approves the calling of this council. St. Cyril is designated as the papal legate, the papal representative at the councils. The Pope didn't attend himself personally. This council, the Council of Ephesus, is the shortest council in the history of the church. It's the shortest council in the history of the church. It lasted one day. It took the Council Fathers one day to condemn Nestorius and to declare that Mary is the Mother of God as she has been venerated. So Nestorius was condemned, deposed, and excommunicated. So we have an end to Nestorius and his heresy here at the Council of Nicaea. Now, several years after the Council of Nicaea, in the western part of the church, we have the arrival of the first great pope in the history of the church. And this is Pope St. Leo I, the Great. Pope St. Leo reigned as Pope from 440 to 461. And Pope St. Leo is called the Great for two reasons. One, he was instrumental in dealing with another heresy that arose in the East, this time the heresy of monophysitism. We'll talk about that in a minute. And he's also known as the Great, or considered the Great, because he was the great defender of the city of Rome. When Rome was under attack, he defended it, and I'll tell you that story in a minute. Now, this monophysitism heresy had arisen by this, came about from this monk in Constantinople called Eutyches. Eutyches denied that Christ had two natures. What he said was that Jesus' human nature was absorbed by Jesus' divine nature. So the whole word monophysitism is a Greek word meaning one nature. So he believed that there was Jesus, and Jesus had a human nature, divine nature, but that human nature was absorbed by the divine nature. So really, in essence, there was only one nature in Christ. Now, I might not think that's a big deal, but if we stop to think about that, what he's saying theologically, in essence, is that Jesus was not truly human. He only had a divine nature. He didn't have a human nature. So he is true God, but in essence, he's not true man. Remember, because we believe that Jesus is like us. He is truly human in all things but sin. Right? So Jesus came, he felt, he had emotions, right? He ate, he felt the need to eat, he was even tempted. He never gave in to those temptations, but he was tempted. So he was truly human. If you deny that Jesus has a human nature, as Eutyches did, then you are denying the fact that he is actually human, that he was actually human. So Pope St. Leo hears about this monophysitist heresy that Eutyches is promulgating, and he writes a letter to the patriarch of Constantinople at this time, a man by the name of Saint Flavian. So Leo writes this book, a letter. It came to be known as the Tome of St. Leo. The Tome of St. Leo. And in here he writes about the understanding, the Orthodox understanding of the church on who Jesus is. That Jesus is one divine person with a human and a divine nature. That he is true God and he is true man. So St. Flavian then excommunicates Eutyches. So Eutyches is upset, obviously his excommunication, so he appeals to the emperor and asks the emperor to call a council to settle the affair once and for all. And so the emperor calls a council that meets in 449. This is Emperor Theodosius II. He calls a council. This council meets at Ephesus in 449. The papal representative to this council asked, when he got before the bishops assembled, he asked to read Leo's tome. He asked to read the letter, the book that St. Leo had written to the Patriarch Flavian in order to help explain this teaching. Eutyches argued against the reading of this book. And he said this book should not be read. He wanted it not to be read. He objected. So the book was not read. The council fathers did not hear what Leo had to say. And so eventually they acquitted Eutyches of heresy and reinstated him in his role in Constantinople. Now Pope St. Leo the Great heard about this council that had been called, and he referred to it as the robber council. It was a fake council. It was a council that didn't do what it was supposed to do, and it was a council that he did not approve of. So eventually, a few years later, in 451, the authentic council was held, and this is the Council of Chalcedon. And here, St. Leo's letter was finally read, and when it was read, the assembled council fathers said this: "That is the faith of the fathers, that is the faith of the apostles, so we all believe. Peter has spoken through Leo." So the Eastern bishops now, and some of the Western bishops who were there, recognize that Leo is speaking from the chair of St. Peter, and he's speaking authentically on this particular event, on this whole heresy. So the council then says, it writes, "Our Lord Jesus Christ is to be acknowledged in two natures, without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation." So this comes to be known in theology as the hypostatic union. It's understanding that there is one divine person of Jesus Christ, and he has a human nature and a divine nature. And his human nature and divine nature exist in this unity of his personhood and divine person. His hypostatic union is here promulgated and defined for us at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Now also, this council adds a canon to its list of issues that it dealt with, and it adds another canon on the whole issue of Constantinople. Remember, we saw how the Council of Constantinople tried to insert Constantinople as second place to Rome. Well, now this council says that Constantinople is equal in authority to Rome. So again, we have the Eastern bishops now trying to exercise more authority over the whole church and trying to place themselves on the same and equal footing as the Holy Father. Leo rejects this canon. But again, just another data point in our whole kind of side story of the tension that exists and is growing between East and West. It will help explain the great event that will happen in the 11th century. Leo is also called the Great, I mentioned, because he's the great defender of the city of Rome. In 452, the Huns were outside the gates of Rome, led by their infamous leader, Attila, and they were ready to sack and destroy the city. St. Leo, with a few of his companions in this small little retinue, go out, and they meet Attila outside the city, and St. Leo talks with him and is able to convince him to turn his army around and not sack the city. And so for that, obviously, the people of Rome were very thankful and appreciative, and hailed Leo as the great savior of the city. Now, several years later, 3 years later, the Vandals would appear before the city of Rome, and this time Leo went out to meet their leader, a man by the name of Genesaric, and he wasn't able to convince Genesaric and his Vandals to leave the city, but he was able to convince them to just sack the city and not destroy it. So just go in and take some loot, but don't actually destroy the whole city. So Genesaric and his Vandals go into the city, and they loot the city, and one of the things they take is the great menorah the seven-branch candlestick that Titus, remember, from Jerusalem,